Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're asking the right questions and they're fair questions. I mean, I've asked it before, is more trying to understand uh, other benefits. Have we had a faster growing economy, therefore lifted more people out of poverty, had better advancements in medicine and medicine tech? You know, do we get the radiology machines we have, or the MRI machines because of this? Have we had more innovation because of that?
And we can talk about absolute living standards too,
Yeah.
and the material. Like, so I do have some disagreements with the whole WTF happened in 1971 graphs. I do think there is a major missed. There is a very major missed interpretation of that data. First of all, like when we look across the last 30 to 40 years, there's this narrative that the middle class, and particularly the lowest quintile, has been falling behind precipitously since the end of Bretton Woods in 1971. Now, when you look at notional price data, that appears to be true, right? Like, and I think that that's why those graphs are so startling and cause like such this intense like moral reaction. The problem is, though, a lot of those graphs are not actually inflation adjusted. They're not adjusted for the average industrial wage across time. They're not adjusted for like a whole bunch of things. So like one of the interesting things that I think people should do when they're trying, if you're trying to ask yourself the question, is the working class, the middle class, like, are they advancing or are they sitting still or are they declining? Price levels are a really bad way to figure that out because, first of all, like there's all these concerns. There's like these hedonic concerns that you have to sort of sort through in order to like sort of figure out what's really going on. Like you have to know what people want first before you can judge whether or not they're getting it, right? This is sort of where hedonic weighting comes in economics. And there isn't like, this kind of comes back to the homo economicus thing, right? Like, so if if the average person wants to eat a lot of macaroni and cheese, right, then whether or not someone can afford a lot of macaroni and cheese is a really important economic indicator, right? Almost nobody eats macaroni and cheese, you probably really shouldn't care that much at a policy level what macaroni and cheese costs, right? This is what hedonic weighting is. It's why when we measure inflation, we do consumer survey data, we go out there to figure out what are the basket of goods that consumers are telling us that they want to buy, and then we are going and we're calculating the CPI based on what people are telling, various different government agencies around the world that collect this data. And a lot of people say that that's suspicious, that we should maintain a constant basket across time. And then I would suggest, well, is that really what you want to do? Because the 1978 basket, which is sometimes used by people to prove that inflation is actually higher than is stated, well, it wouldn't weight the cost of internet access. It wouldn't weight the cost of mobile phones. It wouldn't weight the cost of anything. So it's like, are you really saying you want to leave that stuff out and not track that? Because that's what would happen if you use the 1978 standard. And a lot of people who use this as an argument either don't understand that or they're intentionally misrepresenting that.
Okay, so what you're saying is the amount of there's like, we've got more optionality of the things we want. When we didn't used to have a mobile phone, we could have replaced part of our food purchases with having a mobile phone or internet or holidays
and our food preferences have changed. Like, so, I'll give you another example. Like secularly, we know that sugary sweet sodas have been in a sort of secular decline. Like, I don't know about what it is in the UK, but I know here in the United States, like Americans are consuming less and less like Coca-Cola and Sprite and root beer, and they're increasingly consuming, like flavored sparkling water, right? Like La Croix, and this is why like Visa, like why Coca-Cola and Pepsi have been like really investing in a lot of these brands like to do this. That's a change. Like, so like that means that the cost of Coca-Cola, right, like to the average consumer, is less important. And so when you're calculating the CPI, you want to take that into account, right? Because people's preferences are changing. They want different things in aggregate. That's going to have negative effects on the economies of scale of those things that are falling under favor. So it might not even be expected that they would increase in price given lower economies of scale just based on secular shifts in consumer preferences. So calculating inflation is not straightforward. And a lot of people who think that there's an objective measure and the government should just be using that objective measure and not recalculating the basket of goods all the time really don't know what they're talking about. Like this is a really, really hard problem. And consumer survey data is our only way to like get to that answer. And it's not perfect. Right? Just like no polls are perfect. They don't perfectly measure political, people's political views and stuff. And so these consumer surveys that we do to calculate the basket of goods that we're measuring against are not perfect either. There's a lot of criticisms of them. Like those criticisms should be heard and responded to and considered. But like that's pretty much the best we can do.
But okay, so what would you say that are the fair measures? Because it's not that I disagree with you, but I'm certainly living in a world where I'm seeing noticeable changes to living standards across the board.
Well, the three big big ones are housing, food, and energy.
Yeah,
like those are the really, really big ones. Those are the ones that are pretty constant across time, and we can look at and we can see like what has happened to those things over the last. There's other ones that are important there that are a little further down the list, but pretty still high, like education costs, healthcare costs, transportation costs. Transportation obviously highly correlated to energy costs. So,
so if you look at something like housing costs,
yeah,
and what's the fair measure as a percent of your income, the average?
Well, it depends what you're measuring. This is like a really interesting one. So, there's two ways you can measure the cost of housing, right? Like one is the prevailing rent, in any given area, which most economists will argue is the only real way that you should measure the cost of housing. That like you really shouldn't overly focus on the purchase price of houses. That's actually the wrong thing to do.
Okay.
And you'll note it because one of the things you notice is that and there's this like thing in real estate. There's the rent to price ratio, and what we've seen over time is the rent to price ratio has been actually increasing over time, which like. We can kind of get back to the effect of zero interest rate policy and sort of when these things go too far. But like the amount of leverage that consumers have had to kind of go out and take out jumbo mortgages at 1.7% APR has allowed a relatively fixed supply of housing, particularly in this country, which has been very anti-construction when it comes to housing, is going up against consumers who are operating with more and more leverage. So lo and behold, actual clearing prices for houses are going up and up and up and up. But rents haven't tracked at the same point as price, which actually I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear. In fact, rent to price ratios have been pretty stable across time and have tracked incomes like pretty well. So if everyone was just renting right now, the effect of housing costs would be a lot more muted. Not that there haven't been real challenges there as a result of the housing shortage, but it's nowhere on the magnitude of price appreciation that we've seen as a result of all that leverage in the market. So like I think that's like a really, really important like point to be heard. In fact, we've seen rents coming down in places like New York and San Francisco since COVID, whereas prices are still sky high and they haven't really moved much.
But isn't the argument there then that people do want to own a house and they want to own a property? And yes, the rents might be stable, but the house prices aren't, and it's pushing it further and further away from being something people can afford. I was chatting to Danny about it earlier. My dad helped me buy my first house. Yeah, it was £100,000 house. He let me he lent me 10,000, 5,000 for the deposit, and 5,000 to furnish it, and I paid him back, within a couple of years. And I'm looking to help my son buy a house. And it's considerably more, even as a percent of the house, to even get him close to being able to purchase something. And by the way, he'll probably get a flat where I got a house. Yeah. And so there's a definite, where I live in Bedford, that the house prices over the last 2 decades really have gone up. and they don't match the wage rises.
Yep.
So that's
They have not.
to me.
They have not.
That's
They're way
to me,
ahead. In fact,
yeah.
in fact, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. It's like, I believe like average price appreciation on homes or like over the last like 15, 20 years has been, I mean, depending on the market you're looking at, has been like in the 8 to 11% per year range. Obviously, wages are not rising 8 to 11% per year. Obviously, household wealth is not rising at that rate.
Can we put some blame on the fact that, again, back to what me and Danny were talking about earlier today, I said, I've been talking about retirement. It's something that's on my radar now. At 45, how long do I want to work for? And one of the ideas would be, well, if Bitcoin did X, I could maybe buy 3 or 4 houses. And yes, people would argue keep the money in Bitcoin, but in my head, I get a steady income that comes in every month on the rents. But is it the fact that there's been so much cheap capital out there that there's a privileged group of people who have been able to do that, buy lots of properties, and that's taken it away from other people?
Yeah. Like this is one of the valid criticisms that people have of the way that the fiat system has worked for people. Like there's serious wealth effects that come out of the like zero interest rate policy, right? And that's like very real, and we should take stock of that. But we also have to. But I do think one of the reasons why I sometimes put my back up against the wall is not because that isn't true, and it's not something that we shouldn't like be concerned about, in the sense that we've created this sort of like, like this class of people who've been able to basically essentially get access to free money to leverage up their assets and become massively rich by doing that. But I think we really burned the candle at both ends here, though. Like, we can't underplay the role that land use policies, particularly, and what I mean by land use policies are local zoning policies and ordinances that have precluded the ability for us to expand the housing supply here in the United States and in other markets. Canada has a bad problem with this. Australia has a bad problem with this. London has a bad problem with this. Paris. There's a few like cities around the world that are kind of shining stars that are actually like pretty good at increasing their housing supply. Like Tokyo, surprisingly, as a city of like almost 30 million people, it's actually pretty good at expanding its housing supply, as built up as it is. They have really, really efficient land use policies there. It's pretty straightforward to get a new building approved as long as it's within code, as long as like you tick a whole bunch of different boxes. But and they're very like unpolitical in that sense. And so this idea that like, a lot of people make in places like San Francisco or New York or even here in LA to a lesser extent of like there's no more room, it's just nonsense. There's always, for the right amount of money, like I'm going to sell my house and someone can build a 10-story apartment building on it, right? If the local authorities are willing to issue the building permit, that will just happen, because if you have people flooding in, like there's always going to be a price that an existing property owner is willing to sell for, and there's going to be a willingness of a developer to take advantage of the demand for housing to actually invest in denser residential construction, and that's going to lead to a more stable housing prices. And that's just something we don't do much. Like we say things, like it will cast a shadow or it will alter the character of the city. It's ugly. Like there'll be too much pedestrian traffic. Where's everyone going to park? Like, can the sewage system handle it? Like, there's this parade of like reasons why like local officials give for like never approving new housing. And like that is I want to really be clear about this, because a lot of Bitcoiners have argued with me and say, no, inflationary monetary policy is the only reason why housing costs are going up. It's like, well, no, it's not. Like housing is a supply and demand problem, and demand has been lagging supply for a long time. And by the way, not because developers aren't willing to build. Like developers at least in this state here, can sometimes spend 5, 6, 7, 8 years in court suing local cities to observe their own zoning laws, right? And to get ultimately towards this like builder's remedy that we theoretically have here in California to allow that to happen. That's a real problem.
But I want to push back a little bit on that, just because, like in Australia specifically, I know like housing prices are wild. There's no real, like no one there invests in the Australian stock market. Like if people are investing in the stock market, they'll tend to like invest in the American stock market, and then another proxy for that then becomes housing. And I think a lot of it is down to like debasement of money, looking for somewhere to store your money, and housing being an easier option or a more traditional option.
No, but you got to be careful here. That's true. That's true, but this is where you really need to start thinking about political economy, like as a concept in these markets, right? So yes, one of the real reasons that kind of lurks behind restrictionist housing policies, and in particular, like Sydney, Australia is really bad for this, by the way. In fact, there's a really good book by an urban economist named Edward Glazier called Triumph of the City. And I think he touches a little bit on Sydney and some of the problems there. But existing homeowners, incumbents, like have an inbuilt, like they sometimes let it slip. The mask sometimes slips that like if this happens or you build an apartment building there that casts a shadow on my house, that's going to affect my home value, right? Boom, like right there. The inbuilt economic incentive is, whether I've like fully thought it through or not, is for incumbents to resist competition, because by resisting competition, that means that the equity, the marginal value of their home is going up, right? And so they vote for governments that will restrict housing policies. They form local community organizations to like protest new development. And at the end of the day, the political economy of it is like, yeah, we're trying to turn our houses into piggy banks, and one of the ways we do that is by protecting it from competition. And so that is that's a political economy problem that we have. And yes, and so, but like the inflation side of it is not blameless here. Like we already mentioned how, given that being the state of affairs, if you have an expansionary monetary policy that supports low rates, and by the way, it's not just low rates, by the way, it's also because we subsidize default, like homeowners default insurance, and at least here in the United States we have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and it's like the actual risk of default is defrayed somewhat by the taxpayer here, which is like actually also a big part of the cost of financing. But like that is like that is like one of the key reasons why housing prices are spiraling out of control. And I think like Bitcoiners have a point to make here around the leverage. And also the point you made earlier about people who have access to that leverage being able to use that to like become richer and richer and richer by going out and taking out like really, really cheap mortgages and buying investment properties and renting them out on Airbnb and turning it into like a massive piggy bank. That's real. That's a real problem. That sort of Cantillon effect is real. And I'm not debating that. But like that's not the only thing going on. The world is more complex than that.